And while this is kind of sitting down, tab 22 has some of the investigator interview tips that we went over on the slide. So just a handout sheet with 1 through whatever on the back side, 18, with some suggested interview tips. Nothing very fast. There's also a couple extra tabs, 23, 24, and 25 don't have anything. We're not supposed to have anything, but the tab packet I bought went 1 through 25. So, okay. The next step in this process then, the investigation is concluded, the investigator's job is done. They've written out this very, very detailed report, given it to the Title IX coordinator, who gave it to the parties and the decision maker. It could be that the investigator, him or herself, is responsible for sending that out, but it is sent to the parties with the cover letter that is attached at the beginning of, no, sorry, there's no cover letter here because, well, let me back up. The investigative report is sent with a cover letter that is on the front of under tab 14 that says you have 10 days to ask each other questions. Okay, decision makers have this report that we just went over. The complainant and respondent has the report, and they can ask each other questions in a cross-examination style. Those questions have to go through the decision maker. The decision maker determines if the questions are relevant. A question like, wasn't it true, Natasha, that you had sex with 10 boys when you were 10 years old, isn't relevant to Natasha's allegation of stalking here and now. So that's not one that as a decision maker you would let go through. 10 days have passed now, and the decision maker has a responsibility to decide what happened. Not just what happened, but what the consequence should be. So the template, which is tab 18, and then tab 16, tab 17 is a sample. The template gives you a clear understanding of what information you have to have. You have to have all of the identified sections. A, identification of the allegations, procedural steps, summary or findings of fact, determinations regarding responsibility. It's all spelled out here for you, okay? Luckily, your investigator is very thorough, and the investigative report that was provided to you is very detailed, and so you can do a lot of copying and pasting. In section A, the identification of allegations, you should have a pretty exact statement as to what the allegations are, as to that which appears in the investigative report. And this is important because if the final determination has different allegations than what appeared in the investigative report, that's going to cause an attorney to say, wait a minute, were you looking at something different as a decision maker in terms of what the allegations were? So make sure those are lined up. So here we go. Complainant NR alleges that respondent LO followed her, sent her unwelcome text messages, and posted untrue statements on social media about respondent's sexual interaction with complainant. And if you were to go back and look at the investigative report, this is going to be pretty close to word for word. It would be completely appropriate, and I would encourage you to literally copy and paste from the investigative report that allegations page into the specific allegations section of the final written determination. That way there's no discrepancy. Okay, so we have the allegation, and then we have the procedural steps. Again, this is where it's very helpful that the investigator has already outlined what has happened in the process. So you have the formal complaint that was reported on November 29th to the counselor. The principal contacted the Title IX coordinator that same day. They met in person the following day, explained the process, filed a formal complaint. Supportive measures that were offered. Now the investigator might not have included the supportive measures in his or her report because it's not the investigator's responsibility to offer those supportive measures unless the investigator is also the Title IX coordinator and or the principal of the school. But sometimes the investigator has no idea what supportive measures have been offered because the investigator is just doing the investigation. And so the supportive measures might not be in the investigative report. if you as an investigator are someone who does know and was involved in the supportive measures, put those into your report as well. Because somehow, somewhere, the decision maker is going to have to reach out to someone, Title IX coordinator, principal, and say what supportive measures were offered and when. Document 21 in this binder has a page electronically you'll have where you can document what supportive measures were offered, okay, and what supportive measures were in place. So it might be helpful for the decision maker to have a copy or access to that document as they write the report. Okay. So you're going to outline what supportive measures were in place. In this case, complainant was offered a safety plan, which was implemented December 1st. Safety plan ensured that respondent and complainant would not be in any of the same classes throughout the rest of the school year. Also, complainant may visit with the counselor whenever she feels she is unsafe. Respondent was also offered counselor services, and both parties have been given the option to do online if they preferred. Both parties declined. The notice of allegations also needs to be documented as to when that was sent. That very first letter that goes out to the parties that say, hey, this allegation was received in a formal complaint. Here's our process. Here's what you can expect, et cetera, et cetera. The investigative report should have this date included. So plug in that date and time. All of that other information is just what was in that notice, and that's just boilerplate that you can use from the final written determination. Notice of interviews. Again, this comes right from the investigative report. When the investigator provided that notice of interview to the complainant, when it was provided to the respondent, and what that notice included, which is all the stuff that is required under the regs to have included. And then training tip, have the complainant file the police report, which in this scenario she did not. There would be a section here about the law enforcement investigation. And in the template, there is a section, a parenthetical, where you can add that. Be sure to only include this paragraph if it's true. There's a paragraph right here that talks about law enforcement. Law enforcement was referred to on this date. Here's what they did. Here's where they began their investigation. Here's where it ended. Obviously, if law enforcement wasn't involved, you're going to want to delete that paragraph. Okay?
You have those very often contradict each other. I mean, I guess contradicts is a strong word, but we've gone through, and it's not just for Title IX. I got to be careful. I'm kind of thinking all investigations with students. They don't necessarily contradict, but sometimes they don't line up perfectly, and that's hard.
You mean like the law enforcement fines and what you guys find? Yeah, and one thing.
They do have a higher threshold.
Exactly. So you're going to have to help educate parents. And just because law enforcement determined there's no crime doesn't mean there's not a violation of our policy. There's different standards and there's different language too. Law enforcement is looking to determine whether or not the crime has been committed based on the definition of the crime in state law. We're looking at whether a policy was violated based on the definition of the term in your policy. So even though it's the same conduct, it might result in two different results criminally and administratively.
They just, that's what we've done, and it kind of works. They just use it, parents will just use it as a,
yes.
Law enforcement didn't even find anything, and here you guys can.
Right, and you just have to continue to explain, we're a different entity, this is a school, we're not the criminal system. But yeah, it's more education than anything else. Okay, so then you talk about the interviews. You do not have to rewrite the summary of the interview. The investigative report included all of that interview summary. That's already documented. That's there for your benefit as a decision maker and for the parties to respond if they have any questions of each other. But you do want to document when the parties were interviewed, who was at the interview, and same with witnesses, okay? So that you have all the information about what the investigative process looked like. So this, again, this is kind of a copy and paste from the investigative report if the investigative report is done right. And you can repeat witnesses were interviewed between December 9th and 15th, except for Mary Jane Watson, who was interviewed on January 4th. The regs require you to document your method of gathering evidence. How did you gather evidence? And sometimes all that means is, what did you look at? So between December 6th and December 15th, Investigator Fury gathered evidence through interviews, a review of the school security camera, a review of schedules and grades, collection and review of the following documents from the parties. So this is just a summary of all the evidence you looked at, including the interviews. That's what that means, method of gathering evidence. Well, you interviewed kids, you sat down with the security cameras, you reviewed police reports if there was one. That's all this paragraph is about. Okay? Then you get to the production of evidence, and that means, were the parties given a chance to look at the evidence? Right? I'm crossing my hands because you're giving them to both parties, right? You're giving evidence to the complainant and you're giving evidence to the respondent, same evidence. Yes, evidence and summaries of interviews with witnesses was shared by the investigator with the parties on December 18th. Each party had 10 days to respond to the evidence, and that asterisk just addresses the Christmas break again to explain why the report is finally being written 2 months later instead of 15 days later. Complainant responded by submitting additional screenshots. Respondent requested that an additional witness be interviewed. Investigator interviewed the additional witness, included a summary of the report, and also looked at the screenshots. And then you explained that the investigative report was also submitted to both parties. On January 10th, 2026, the investigator submitted a final investigative report to the Title IX coordinator for distribution to the parties and the decision makers. Title IX coordinator sent the final report to both parties with a notice that they had 10 days to ask each other questions. They didn't ask each other anyone questions, and so here we are on December 25th. The decision maker completed this final written determination. All of that we just talked about is procedural. Check those boxes. We did this. Okay? Then you get into the analysis. Findings of fact. Now again, if your investigators follow this template and include an undisputed fact section, the job of the decision maker is that much easier. Because all you have to do is copy the undisputed facts section and say, here's what nobody is disputing. Here's what everyone agrees to. That means that my job as a decision maker is going to narrow from this huge allegation to this. This is the only thing that I really have to figure out, okay? So we have, again, a copy and paste of what we just left off with in terms of the undisputed facts. And it should be copied and pasted. It shouldn't be rewritten. One, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And two, you want it to look exactly like the investigator wrote it so that you're not making up disputed facts. Now I will say, as a decision maker, you do have the responsibility of looking at all of the evidence and making a determination. That's your job. You're the decision maker. And so if you look at the undisputed facts and you say, I don't know what that's really undisputed. I think that there's still some question about whether or not this happened. Say, for example, whether or not Bruce Banner did in fact create that Instagram post or hack into the Instagram account without being told to do so by a respondent. Maybe there's some evidence that the investigator had gathered that suggests perhaps Bruce Banner was operating at the request or the direction of the respondent. And so you're looking at this after the investigator has said there's no dispute as to whether or not Bruce Banner created or hacked into the account, and you're going, well, I think there's still some question. So you can take an undisputed fact and put it in the disputed section. That's okay. You can say, actually, I think that something in the disputed section is undisputed. Both parties agree with it. As a decision maker, you're the ones with responsibility for finally determining what's a fact and what is yet not determined to be a fact. Okay? But by and large, if you've got good investigators and people that you are working with well, then they're going to be undisputed facts that we're not going to have to redo. Okay, so the disputed facts are really where your job starts. All of the decision-making determinations I've sat in on, I sat through all of them, but we were part of the decision-making team. The first part is just a matter of what date was that, and they work in a team. So what date was that, when did that get sent, and now is when they really start analyzing. Did this happen, right? So you go through each disputed fact, one by one. The first one, respondent claims that parties had sex. Complainants deny that they had sex. Okay, so this is your opportunity to determine, oh, I shouldn't have shown you that finding. Dang, go up. Whether it's more likely than not that they had sex. I'll leave that one because we've already seen it. So, as decision makers, you decide, first of all, whether it's more likely than not that they had sex. What do you think? Okay, yeah. Now, you're going to have to explain why you think that, okay? This is what they teach you in law school. This is law school 101, the very first year. You're like, well, why is the sky blue? Because it's blue. Like, what more do you need? And you're taught to identify the reason and the rationale for everything, things that you didn't think needed an explanation. Here, you're being asked to explain, why do you think the parties had sex? So I'm going to ask you, why do you come to that conclusion? Why do you think that they did? Why do you think it's more likely than not that what respondents said about their sexual history is accurate as opposed to complainants?
Because of what the witnesses all said.
Okay, because of what the witnesses all said.
They had no reason
Specifically,
why.
okay, Thor's information was credible because we already talked about this. It was a spontaneous and contemporaneous report, okay? Because of what? Who else talked about it?
Well, her best friend.
Her best friend,
Yeah.
right? And her best friend is not one who's going to make something up because it adversely affects the complainant. I think that's probably the most persuasive information, okay? So you write that. We find it more likely than not, the complainant, it's we or I, there's one person making the decision, choose your appropriate pronoun. The complainant had sex with respondent at a time when they were dating the summer before their 11th grade year. And here's why. Complainant's best friend reported to the counselor the complainant had sex. The best friend had no reason to make this information up, and she was worried about reporting it at all because complainant had asked her not to. Also, respondent's brother and best friend reported respondent had told them that he had sex with her immediately after it happened. Respondent does not claim that they had sex more than once, so we're not getting into whether or not it's an ongoing relationship. Yes?
So the school counselor that Pepper Potts was talking to, is there a privilege there where the school counselor, Pepper Potts, is coming for counseling and worried about a friend?
Great question.
Or there to be some confidentiality there?
That's a really good question, and one I'm going to probably have to do a little bit of research and get back to you on. When it comes to Title IX investigations, the employees have an obligation to tell you what they know about a sexual harassment allegation. In the higher ed context, there are specific employees that are designated as confidential employees, basically, where they are someone who a person can talk to without that person reporting. But in K-12, there are mandatory reporters.
Because it seems to me as an administrator that's investigated a case, cases close to this, that I was able to protect friendships when I was able to take the brunt of the family's displeasure instead of Pepper Potts now getting taken to task by
By the friend.
Black Widow. Yeah.
Black Widow. Right.
Natasha, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think that there's a distinction between what is legally allowed. Is the counselor legally allowed to share information that she received during this counseling discussion versus what is best for relationships, right?
I understand. It's just I'm like,
Yeah.
sitting here like, more drama in the school for another 3 months.
I will say that's one of the greatest criticisms I've seen about this whole process is that it is so transparent that kids are being ratted out against their friends. And it's not just a counselor, but it's a friend who's saying, yeah, I saw this happened. And the parties have a right to know who is saying what. And in the higher ed world, where they're all adults, maybe that's the best practice. But in K-12, where we are trained to tell witnesses, what you tell me stays here. It's confidential. I have a job to do. I need to investigate, but I'm not going to tell the respondent what you told me. You can't say that anymore.
Yeah.
That's hard. With regard to the counselor specifically, I'll look into more about that privilege.
Well, I was just wondering about the counselor, I'm not worried
Yeah.
about like all the,
Yeah.
is that neither here nor there, but.
Right. Yeah, and that's a good question. I would interview the counselor anyway, and give the information that you have, because first and foremost, she's a district employee, and you're doing a legal investigation for harassment.
So I'm gonna ask a dumb question.
No dumb question.
Representing all of you, because you're thinking this and you wanna ask the guy. I struggle with why it's such a big deal that we prove or disprove that they even had sex. I'm looking at the things that, like stalking or an unhealthy environment for learning, and those things, like, it just feels like we've spent so much time trying to determine if they had sex.
Right.
Why does that, help me understand why that matters?
Good question.
That was the allegation, that was the allegation.
No, the allegation is, like, she's claiming, I think sex just came up as a side note. What she's concerned with, in my opinion, is she doesn't want to be stalked anymore. She wants him to go away. She wants separation.
But as the nature of that stalking, she's using the fact that he's weaponizing a rumor
Right.
that they've
So
had
it's
sex.
a side note.
Right, but even in her attempts to establish stalking, for me in this, remember, we're dealing with 10th graders and a 10th grade boy and a 10th grade girl that are both dramatic, using the terms from the investigation, and just socially awkward, 4 texts over the course of 60 days. That could be one of 2 things. You know, he could be stalking her, yes, or it could be ill intent, but if it's just social awkwardness, just really doesn't understand. And from his perspective, the fact that they've proven she's lying to everybody and that we didn't have sex, and I'm just being honest. I don't know why she's lying. That to me is why I think that's really at the heart of a lot of this is it proves one thing about the situation to me is that she's totally embarrassed about it and trying to hide and cover up. And he, from the very beginning, has just said, look, I've been honest about everything I've done, I didn't deny
And
it.
the only problem with that, like, I appreciate that point, and that's helpful, but where it got toxic was him calling her these sexual names, and him his friend posted those are the things that I'm like, this is inappropriate behavior, this is toxic behavior.
But is inappropriate behavior,
Regardless
sexual
if they had sex or not, it's
sexual
totally
harassment?
inappropriate.
Or is it just a teenage boy calling her some inappropriate names once, maybe twice, which that would not fall, to my way of thinking, as out of the realm of what 10th graders do.
Right.
in
And
normal
keep in mind, there
behavior.
were 2 instances where he posted, 3 instances where he said online that they had sex. And in his defense, he's saying, I just wrote a song about what happened, and I posted it on my TikTok, and I didn't think anybody saw it. What she's alleging is that he is spreading rumors about this relationship they didn't have. So that's one,
So you can prove
independent.
it's not a rumor, so to speak.
Right, and whether it's okay or
Yeah, that's
not
what I'm saying.
isn't really the issue. It's, does it add up to stalking or creating a hostile environment? The other one is the Snapchat he posted where he, uses the graphic of what they did. And she's saying that didn't happen. He's going around telling everyone that things happened and they didn't happen. And the third is the Instagram account, which he didn't do, right? So these are all pieces that could add up to a hostile environment or stalking, depending on what you're looking at. And if they have had a consensual sexual relationship, it makes the respondent's conduct not okay, but less severe in terms of the severity analysis.
That's what I needed
Yeah.
that piece.
Yeah,
That's A,
and
and
I'll be honest, after this last year, that's been the hardest thing for us, is that fine line, that sliver between Title IX
yeah,
violation
right.
and just code of conduct, and where, and we came out of the guns, like, after last year's training, just totally shell-shocked. It was scary. It's like, we have to investigate everything, and we had to be walked back from the edge a little bit. But that fine line to distinguish, and this, I'll say, has been the hardest and the most conversations for us this last year, is where is that fine line, that sliver between, yeah, what he did was not right.
Right.
Regardless.
Right.
It's inappropriate.
It's
a
still
code of-
stalking and it's
Yeah,
still
a code of
harassment.
conduct, it's a code of conduct issue. But does it fall into the Title IX issue and when does it? But you can't do the investigation first to determine that, you have
Yeah.
to.
Right.
Especially with the allegations that Natasha brought up front, right? And I would say that the second reason it's important is because it really helps the decision maker understand a little bit more about Natasha's credibility. If she's lying about something as central to her own allegations up front, she's like, this did not happen, then what else is she
Yeah, there's
lying
definitely
about?
some credibility
Yeah.
issues.
So that's why I think that piece is important. Yeah, comment.
So you probably covered this, but backing up to when you start your investigation and you're interviewing your witnesses, it occurred to me that as you were going through this, that a copy was provided to the complainant and the respondent. So do you tell your witnesses up front, everything that you say, or we're going to give copies of everything you say?
That's a good question. You can.
But then
You
they won't
aren't
say
legally
anything.
required to.
It's just, we're
They'll
already
know,
seeing-
it'll be pretty quick, the very first Title IX investigation that happens at your school, all the witnesses are gonna know that it was provided. I know that some,
I would just see them.
It's not required that we let them know that the information.
not under the Title IX regulations.
Because I thought, maybe I'm wrong, in one of the forms that we have, that we start with in explaining the process, right in there, it says there has to be full disclosure of all information to both parties.
To the parties, not the witnesses.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the respondent could request everything stated by that side and the,
Have to.
Yeah, give it to them, whether they request it or
Not request, we have to.
We give it to them. I know that some organizations suggest, and this works too, that your investigative report only has initials or even witness number 1, witness number 2, witness number 3,
Can we do that?
with a separate document that has the names of the witnesses for the decision makers. My concern with that, and I think that puts you on just sketchy legal ground, is that the parties are entitled to ask anybody cross-examination
due
questions.
process, yeah.
Yeah, that due process. And so, and it makes sense if there are, 10 witness 1 through 5, I'll use example, who are saying, absolutely, Loki did this, and Loki knows that the witnesses are not credible because of all these other things that have been happening. This witness was kicked out of school because she lied and made up rumors that someone was stalking. Then the respondent has a right to know that and to be able to challenge that witness's credibility for the determination of the decision maker. So it's tough.
They're kids, like,
I
it's so
know.
frustrating.
I know.
Look at their children.
What does it look like when
Why they
a
can have a
respondent
parent or
challenges
an
the complaint?
attorney there with them.
So the question is, what is it, sorry, 2 questions here, let me just get to this one, we'll get that one. What does it look like when the respondent challenges the complainant? The challenge is in the form of a question. So the respondent can submit questions to the complainant, challenging credibility, just like you would on the stand, right? Isn't it true that? Whether they phrase it that way or not is not important. The decision maker determines whether or not the question is going to help you make your decision. If the respondent is raising questions about how the complainant was mean to her little sister when she was in 5th grade, that doesn't matter. And so the decision maker can say, we're not going to allow that question. But if the respondent is asking Natasha a question, for example, is it true that, or can you speak to the time where you filed allegations of a sexual harassment complaint on the basis of stalking to 5 other boys just last school year? That might be a relevant question for a complainant to have to answer to. Okay? And for decision makers to be like, oh, that's true, that's a response. So this whole process seems to be written for higher ed. And I think one of the benefits of this shift that is possibly coming in the next school year is that it's bringing back into K-12 what K-12 administrators are used to doing. But right now it is what it is. All right, let's go to the next disputed fact. Complainant says that respondent sent her text obsessively after they broke up and threatened to kill himself if she didn't respond. Respondent said that he sent complainant a text because he wanted to be friends after the breakup and was only kidding about killing himself. Okay, so decision makers, what do you find? What is the finding regarding this specific factual allegation?
More likely than not.
And more likely than not, who do you believe? And you can come down to somewhere in the middle.
I think there's been confirmation about his suicidal statements,
Okay.
but the level or the number of text messages is not warranted. So we have credibility on the messaging, but we don't have credibility or finding on the breadth of
Okay.
those texts.
Okay? Anyone else have a different
I may
response?
have missed it, but was there ever a request for him to stop texting?
Not by her. That's a good question. Did
Yeah.
she ever ask him to stop texting?
That was a question that, that I had from the very beginning in this whole situation. And with text, there should have been a record of everything in text. That's easy to get,
Mhm.
easy to produce on both sides. And then, she was saying that they were every hour, but yet beyond her, I didn't see any evidence or anywhere where it
And
says.
she didn't have any of them.
The more we got is he did come forward with his text and said, here you go, you can have them. You have
Right.
4 texts in 60 days.
There was also a very subtle piece of information in Peter Quill's testimony, and if you caught it, 2 things. One, he reported having seen a text by a respondent where the complainant says, I would be so sad if you killed yourself, right? Suggesting that she was responding to him. And then secondly, Peter said that sometimes when respondent would walk down the hall, complainant was walking and talking with him. And sometimes she was on her phone, right? And so you do have to, the question arises, was this an obsessive one-sided communication, or was there some response? And there's not an, and again, looking at the evidence, so finding that I think makes sense. You might come to a different conclusion, decision makers. The respondent did send the complainant dozens of texts after they broke up between August and November, but the complainant responded to most of these texts without any indication that she was bothered, annoyed, intimidated, or scared. We also find that the respondent did make vague references to killing himself, but based on his own and Bruce's statement, he was not actually suicidal, would not have carried this out, regardless of whether he intended to or not, because that's not really the question, right? Whether he actually had intent to commit suicide. We find the threats genuinely concerned complainant. Okay.
I think we have to be careful to leave out why, like, we don't know why he was threatening
Right.
to kill himself. You
Right.
assume he was trying to pressure her or something, but that's not part of the
It's
investigation.
not part of the evidence.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So when it comes to that disputed fact, this is the finding that is supported by the evidence. Okay.
So as a decision maker, I'm assuming it's really hard to not pull in theory of those whys, like Kate just said. So getting too far onto the speculation on
Mhm.
motive, right?
Right.
So those statements need to be very clear of eliminating motive, because we can't make determination of motive. That's a whole
Not
different,
unless you have evidence.
that's right. So,
So everything that follows your first sentence, in terms of we find that, needs to be supported by the evidence. Okay? Why do you think that? Well, because we saw the text messages, but there was no indication. We didn't have any evidence that she was bothered or scared about the messages themselves. We saw that she responded to most of them, but we do have evidence from complainant herself that says she was concerned about it. We don't have any reason to believe that she was lying about her concern. Okay, let's go to the next one. Complainant alleged that respondent posted untrue statements that they had sex online, that they had sex both through TikTok video and a Snapchat post. And because we've already determined in number 1, you can go back to that, find the respondent's social media posts in which he implied or stated outright that he and complainant had sex were not untrue statements. Based on finding number 1, the complainant and respondent did actually have sex. Okay? So that was not untrue, it was a double negative. Meaning her allegation is he posted these untrue statements, okay? And that was deeply disturbing to her. The fact is they weren't untrue, okay? They were true. And so not
Got
that
a
it's
college
okay.
boyfriend now, though. She doesn't want that stuff out.
I know, right now Steve, or Tony Stark says, might break up with her because she is
He knows
not.
she's a virgin,
Yes, yes. She told him.
Now, this is not, Tony Starks doesn't get access to this report, but they might be having a conversation now.
Kid, don't worry.
Yeah. What about this one? Complaint, let me just really quick pause and say, you see how helpful it is if the investigator breaks down the disputed and undisputed. Because all you have to do is go through all the undisputed and say, who do I believe and why? And you've met your obligation under the finding, determining whether the facts, each allegation is true or not true. So this next one, complainant said that respondent followed her, often at school, and would not leave her alone. Respondent said that at the beginning of the school year, they had 2 classes together. Even after she's checked out of classes, they still had classes that were near each other. He just happened to be in the same hallway. Okay, what do you think? Based on the evidence we've seen, whose statement is more likely than not true?
I think it is.
It's kind of like the first one, because it's not, I don't know that she ever asked him to stop texting her. Never, did she ever ask him to stay fully awake? There wasn't, never evidence.
And that's the way to state it. There's not any evidence to support the complainant was bothered, annoyed, scared, at his presence.
And you have witnesses that stated that, yeah, they walked down the hall together
Yep.
indifferently with each other, sometimes on the phone, sometimes talking. And that was even after the breakup, right?
Yes.
Yeah, not just students, but you had a teacher, and you had the video that.
Right.
there to
Right.
show.
So, these are awesome. We find upon a review of the parties' class schedules that respondent did in fact have classes in the same part of the school the complainant did. Okay, that's your finding of fact. We also find it more likely than not, based on respondent's admission of how much he liked complainant, that respondent tried to wait for complainant and or be near her as they both walked to class. This finding is also somewhat supported, because it's hard to see on the security footage, by the security camera footage. Okay? So you kind of have a finding of, yes, they did go to the same classes together, he could follow her, and it's more likely than not that he did it because he liked her. But was he trying to scare her or stalk her? And we probably could have added, and should have added, that it wasn't, no evidence that she was concerned by that. Okay? Complainant states that the stalking was so bad that she decided not to try out for volleyball in order to avoid respondent. Respondent contends that this is not the reason complainant did not try out for volleyball. Okay, what do you think?
Yeah, well, that
It's
was,
not the reason.
it was for piano.
Yeah. Finally, complainant decided not to try out for volleyball because her parents wanted her to focus on the piano and not because complainant was worried about respondent stalking her. Okay? This all goes again, not partly to credibility, but also to whether or not the elements of stalking can be met, because part of that is the complainant feeling threatened. Okay, explain why. Next, we've got complainant said the respondent hacked her Instagram account, posted a manipulated picture of her giving oral sex. Respondent said he did not do this and that he didn't know how to hack an Instagram account. And we're just going to assume, for simplicity of this discussion, that you're going to accept Peter's admission and
Investigate the heck out of him for
investigate
several
him.
other things.
Yeah, there's that.
Which always happens, and not to mention you saw bad stuff on the video while you were looking at it.
Right.
See if they were walking together.
That
So yeah,
too.
investigate that.
While you're watching
Yeah,
all region
well, you see
investigate
2
dinner.
other things going on.
Yes, exactly. Okay, what about complainant alleged that respondent followed her and once blocked her car in the school parking lot? Respondent said he did not intentionally block her car, but his car stalled behind hers.
I don't think.
So,
Hard installed.
I'm new car.
Yeah, the car installed.
Since it's number 7 down the list, of the 2 of them, he's the only one that hasn't lied.
Okay?
And even the resource officer said, could have, it looked like it could have
Okay.
stalled, I can't tell you. So, given those 2, I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt here.
But his
Okay.
brother said it was a brand new car and it never stalled.
Car that stalled.
Maybe it's a brand new car that has that auto shut off. He
Diesel
didn't know about
Diesel
it.
fluid.
There you go.
Case in point, me trying to pull out a district parking lot with one of those.
Computer issue.
Well, this decision maker, you could have come down either way. And the point is, as long as you can explain why you came to that conclusion. So exactly what was just said, I could have said that it did stall because so far the respondent has not been dishonest about anything. And it's the only one that hasn't. So that would be a basis or evidence to support. You could also find the car did not stall, but rather more likely than not, in fact, parked his car behind her. Neither respondent's brother or best friend could confirm that the car had a tendency to stall, and both of them had been in the car several times, and it was brand new. I didn't even put that in. And it was brand new. Okay? Now, we'll get to the next section, but before we move on, this is what court opinions do. This is, you all just were great, fantastic lawyers just then. The idea is to break the allegation into the undisputed facts, and then one by one say, did this happen or did it not? And why do I think it did? I think instinctively, we all have a reason for why we believe something happened or didn't happen. It's just articulating that reason. Put it into writing based on the evidence. And you have you've successfully identified the findings of fact. Okay? So the next section is conclusions regarding application. So all Section C did was identify what you believe happened. That's not to say whether Loki engaged in stalking, which is a form of sexual harassment. That's what we're going to do next, okay? And this is another analysis that try to make it easy for you by making it this way. So we're going to just focus on the stalking. You could have put in the severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive as well, but again, for this purpose, we'll do one. So the allegations in the formal complaint most closely align with the following marked definition of sexual harassment. And the reason that you want to identify which one is an issue is because each of these have a specific definition. And you're going to have to look at that definition to determine whether or not the facts that you just got done figuring out support that definition. Okay? So we're looking at stalking. And again, you could put hostile environment up at the second section. You could have done both, but we'll just, for purposes of this discussion, stick to stalking. Okay? And you can say, we conclude the respondent, I'm going to give you the end from the beginning, did not violate the sexual harassment policy by engaging in stalking for the following reasons. And you're not going to be able to answer or write that paragraph until you write the next paragraph. So you'll leave that one blank for a minute, and you go to the next paragraph. Whatever you mark above, you're going to go to your policy and copy and paste the definition. Okay? So if you marked stalking, or you marked the harassment, the severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, that one is defined in its term. You're going to put that definition in this section right here. Stalking is defined by our policy as engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for his or her safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. Okay? The policy also defines course of conduct as 2 or more acts, including but not limited to acts in which the stalker directly, indirectly, or through third parties by any action, method, device, or means follows, monitors, observes, surveys, threatens, or communicates to or about a person or interferes with their property. And finally, substantial emotional distress is defined as significant mental suffering or anguish that may, but does not necessarily, require medical or other professional treatment or counseling. Okay? Do you think complainant suffers substantial emotional distress? So we gotta address it though. We can't just say, therefore it didn't happen. We conclude that respondent engaged in several identifiable acts that complainant believed to be stalking, namely, text messages following complainant posting on social media about their relationship and blocking complainant's car with his own. However, we conclude that none of these acts would cause a reasonable person to fear for his or her safety or cause emotional distress, and then explain why. Nothing respondent texted or posted was threatening to complainant's physical well-being, and following complainant in school when he could have been going to his own classes near complainant's was also not physically threatening. Nor did she ever mention that she was physically threatened, right? There is insufficient evidence to suggest that complainant suffered substantial emotional distress by respondent's actions. There is very little evidence to suggest that complainant suffered emotional distress at all. I mean, not in what we heard. Her grades did not drop. She continued to go to school and remain socially active. Neither complainant's best friend nor her boyfriend reported noticing that complainant seemed distressed at all. And complainant never spoke to her counselor about her concerns until respondent blocked her car in the parking lot. Also, complainant's assertion that she didn't try out for volleyball because of respondent is not supported by the evidence. We conclude that the totality of the evidence does not support the complainant had significant mental suffering or anguish. So you got a lot of pieces in this definition above. You've got things like, first of all, there has to be a course of conduct directed at the person. Well, that probably did happen. Was it, would it cause a person to fear for his or her own safety? We don't think it did in this case. But even if it did, it has to result in substantial emotional distress. And none of the evidence supports the complainant suffered substantially, right? The reasons stated above, we conclude the respondent did not sexually harass complainant by stalking her. I'm going to take just a second and open up the template that is document 16 in your binder if you want to take a look at that, or you can look it on the screen here.
In your opinion, if she would have said, stop texting me, leave me alone, stay away from me, did that change the outcome of this investigation?
What do you think?
I mean, if he continued to at that point, then it does become, I think she would be like scared.
Okay?
I do, like, because that's what stalking
Okay,
is.
you think a reasonable person would be scared. Is there
Because she said
evidence
stop.
that this person was scared?
I mean, that's hard to say, because if she had said, I guess no, but
And
if she would have
that
said, leave me alone, stop texting me, stay away from me, this is over.
Right.
And he kept doing those
Right.
things,
It
then it would cause
strengthens
a
the harassment side. It would strengthen the harassment side, but it wouldn't, I don't think it would push it to in fear for her safety or fear for her. The action, the action is what we can't prove, is
Yeah.
that there's an action that caused.
I think it supports the allegation.
There's still no evidence.
There's still no evidence of
So you
distress.
haven't met the full-
Right.
The full standard of stalking.
Right.
It makes it more obvious that he's got some issues he's gotta work out and probably some code of conduct to deal
Right.
with. But it still doesn't meet the stalking standard, in my opinion.
And maybe a reasonable person would be fearful, but did the complainant demonstrate substantial emotional distress? That's a piece of
If
the
you added
definition.
that, if you added that and said she started to see a therapist,
Yes,
or she's having anxiety issues because she can't go to school, I think that kicks
or
her.
any other evidence that supports that something has changed in
I'm
her.
just saying, I think in general, that's what it leads to, like if someone, I know it's not the definition, the legal definition of stalking, but
Well,
generally what happens with stalking, if they say no, and the person continues to constantly engage with them, then it does turn to fear. I mean, it's impossible to know what would happen here, because she didn't, and it went forward. But, I mean, you would still have to prove that. It just seems, man, at that point, if she clearly has said stop, leave me alone, that's what stalking is, in my brain, is when they won't leave them alone, when they've said not.
Heidi, one
Yeah.
thing that you struggle with
Yeah.
is that, clinically, that's how we have to look at it. But the hard part is, I mean, we dealt with a recent situation where the victim, it was a distress on them, but the finding for, it wasn't even our case, it was in the county, it was an actual legal case, and we're just trying to manage it in the school building. The victim, it will never, your efforts and your work, you're trying to help them deal with their situation will never be enough. But you're trying to find, you have to run and operate clinically because you have two parties you're trying to serve, and so what Kate's saying is totally right, because you want to say, this isn't right, this isn't a good action, this is not acceptable. But when we go clinically and we look at it from the definitions, we're held to manage that. But the victim or the complaint is still looking at you saying, that's it? That's all you're gonna do? Because we will never gauge what it felt to them, right? What that
Right.
So that's the hard part. So we're talking very clinically,
Very legal, that's
but
exactly right.
we know that there's a whole other side to that complaint and what they're feeling and also how we can manage it well, but we can't manage it to their liking all the
You
time.
always offer supportive measures no matter what the outcome. You can always handle it under a different code of conduct policy. But if there is no evidence to support that there's substantial emotional distress, hard to see it stalking. Okay? Yeah. So take a look again at the template, and I'll give you another definition. So everything in red is just kind of an example of how to address it. So once again, you look at the complaint form, and it should at the outset have what definition you're going to be operating under when you do this analysis. Say it's sexual assault, okay? So you go to your policy and you define, take and copy and paste the definition of sexual assault. And then you go through each one of the definitions, each one of the sections of definition, and determine, is there support for this that meets this definition? Okay? And that's again where that legal analysis comes. We know what the facts are, at least we've concluded what we think they are. Did that conduct meet the clinical, technical, whatever you want to use, legal definition that you were bound by in the policy? Okay? So let's get back to Loki here and Natasha, and you can see that the final determination is that respondent is not responsible for sexual harassment under the policy. Now you could, and I didn't, but you could, as a decision maker, say, however, we think that respondent engaged in a violation of our code of conduct, section A, number 3, by calling her inappropriate names and violating our acceptable use policy, something to that effect, right? So you could still address it, you just can't call it sexual harassment. Then you have a recommendation about what the appropriate conduct should be. Appropriate sanction. We recommend respondent receive no disciplinary action. Rather, we recommend he should be offered counseling to help him develop more appropriate social skills. This is just an example. It could be that you do recommend some aspect of discipline. But unless you find a violation of some other policy, you're not going to want to discipline him, because what it says is there's no violation, but we're going to discipline anyway. So if you're not going to find a violation of sexual harassment policy or another student code of conduct policy, probably not a good idea to recommend a distinction. Yes?
This behavior continues.
Absolutely.
These are actions that
Absolutely. Yep. If this behavior continues and we get reports, especially from complainant, that he continues to follow her, then we are going to take action in this manner. Absolutely. Okay. Any remedies, we recommend that they don't have their schedules together. We also recommend that they continue to visit with counselors. And then here's your procedures for appeal. And this is just a copy and paste from your policy. And that's your process. If they appeal, then you go through that process. Is there a basis for the appeal? What is the basis for the appeal? And it goes to the appeal officer to make the determination. Okay. Questions, comments about the determination?
Hey, real quick on the determination.
Yes.
When you look at moving forward and you want to put something in there about, you know, these are the expectations, is that expectations to both parties?
It could be.
Because all of a sudden, we started out with a complainant and a respondent.
Right.
But if things go a certain way, all of a sudden is the respondent the only one that has an expectation?
Good question. No. And at any point in time, the respondent can turn around and become the complainant too. But in your final report, I haven't seen anything that suggests that you cannot make recommendations for appropriate behavior skills, classes, training for both parties, if you find that both parties are at fault. I would not recommend issuing discipline for the complainant, or you're going to shield your reports of sexual harassment. But you could recommend some kind of non-punitive.
That makes sense.
Try not to lie next time a little bit.
Yeah, something like that. Jason.
Just tone it down a little bit, sure.
Okay?
What would your recommendation be for that aspect?
What do you guys think? In this situation in particular, what are some possible interim supportive measures, interim remedies that could have been implemented during the investigation, which is going to take at a minimum 2 10-day periods plus the investigative questions, at a minimum 30 days, right?
The counselor available is
Okay,
easy.
counselor,
Class.
Schedule.
So that
schedule
was,
changes.
my big question is, what if Natasha's parents are insistent that Loki not be at school, that he can't be there until the investigation's over?
That's hard,
For her
you know, all the
safety.
time.
Then
And
they
you
think
have
for
to
her
help-
safety, he has to be removed from
How about
school until the
blocking his
investigation.
number? Like, that would be the first thing as a parent to do.
You
is
could do that.
His number, so you don't get the text.
Right, and the response is you're gonna have to have a hard conversation with parents and say, we are not allowed under law to suspend this student until we know for sure what happened. Now, I've seen situations where the respondent's parents say, you know what, we'll keep him at home and do online because it's safer for him that way too. And if you get a voluntary withdrawal during the time of the investigation, great. But you have to help complainants' parents understand we cannot punitively remove this student from school until we follow our process and make sure we know what happened. I'm so sorry, parents. Complain to the Department of Education. Yeah. Any questions? The only other thing I wanted to point out real quick is now that you know the whole story, if you look at tab 8, the informal resolution agreement, which is a sample of an informal resolution agreement between Loki and Natasha, if they had chosen to go that route, it will make sense to you now, and it will help you understand what are some potential terms of an agreement like that that could be reached if they chose to go the informal resolution route. Questions? It's a lot of information. It's about 3:30. You guys have been awesome and engaged. Thank you. I'm done. I don't have anything else to share, but you're welcome to. As far as these binders go, if you would just leave them here for a bit, and then maybe I'll send one home per district, and we'll talk to Jason. I'm going to make this available to Keith, so we stuff. I will get that to you later this week. If that's okay.
Okay, so in Midas, if your name was not on this list, your name will not be in Midas to receive relicensure credit. Come and talk to us back here in the corner. I think we've gotten everybody on here, but we've been trying to go through the list, but sometimes we can't see everybody. Just make sure that if you haven't signed this personally, that you come back and talk to us so that we get your Midas credit. And then just Heidi, thank you so much. Big process, and just thanks for coming down.
Thank you all.